Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. It's time to have a look at the future when it comes to War Thunder. The simple fact is, nowadays, especially with the devlogs coming pretty soon, it's time to have a think about what is not just necessarily required for nations, but also what would be really cool to see. That is the part which I've personally been focusing more on the last few years, not exactly what, nations require, because that seems to come over time, but also just the idea that it's cool to see some interesting stuff. So this video is dedicated to a bunch of vehicles that were kind of in that weird space for the longest time, but with a bunch of different mechanics coming around and also changes to how the game works, such as, the BR differences between air and ground. They might actually work now, which would be really cool. So America is the first nation we're going to have a look at, and then of course there are many more else to come. Let's get started. There's plenty of planes around which basically fill roles that you usually don't hear about in terms of combat. The nitty-gritty roles is probably the way to put it, and one of those vehicles that is able to fulfill a lot of them is the OV-10 Bronco. The Bronco is a vehicle that didn't just serve for the US, but also served for many other nations, including Thailand, meaning that maybe it comes to the Japanese tree one day. It might finally be something to replace the good old R2-Y2s. The OV-10 Bronco is a multi-purpose aircraft, is probably the best way of saying it. It's not an air superiority fighter, but it's more designed to fill out a lot of roles which came around in the last 50 years. It's designed as a light attack aircraft, but also a counter-insurgency combat aircraft, and even a forward air control aircraft too, plus a reconnaissance aircraft. So this one really fills out a bunch of those different roles, which you don't really see in War Thunder. Usually when vehicles like this get added, they definitely have a pretty rough time. At the same time though, it was used a lot by the US, and also had a bunch of upgrades to it, meaning that you could do event vehicles, you could do premiums, and you could do ones with different sets of armaments. The major thing about this vehicle though, is it's another one of those which doesn't have great flight characteristics, but can carry ridiculous ordnance. And with the next update coming in, and them changing between what BRs certain vehicles have in certain game modes, that will help out the OV-10 a hell of a lot. So for example, this thing has two turboprops, the Garrett T-76s. Give it a lot of power, but also it's a pretty heavy beast, meaning that it still can only go 460 kilometers an hour. This is not a fast vehicle at all. But also, it has access to a 20mm, and can also get access to smaller caliber machine guns too. Plus, it has a bunch of hardpoints which can carry either rockets, or bombs, or guess what? Air-to-air missiles, and that's where this vehicle gets a little bit dodgy, right? Kind of like the fact that it can carry all of these weird and wonderful ordnance options means that it doesn't really fit, but after next update, it will. This vehicle was introduced in the late 60s and was retired by America in the 90s, showing that it fulfilled a very extensive role over nearly a 25-year period. And it just came in many different forms. And as I said, it's been used all over the world by many different operators, even including the West German Air Force, meaning that we could get this in the German tech tree, the Japanese tech tree, and even the US tech tree, and many others, depending on where they throw it in. But as I said, it's well worth looking into, since it is a really kooky aircraft, and at the same time, it's ugly as sin. We've talked a lot about America and how it has this huge SPA gap in the middle of it, and how there are options to try and fill it. But one of the vehicles that I feel like wouldn't really fill it, but is also really cool, is the T-52 MGMC. This is an American SPAG, which has access to a Sherman hull, the M4A2 hull specifically, but a unique turret known as the kind of T-62 gun mount, and then of course the turret on top of it, which has access to a 40mm and then 250 cals. This thing was built in the middle of the Second World War, I believe in 1942, and yeah, it's just a completely nuts vehicle, which is a little bit fun. The fact is, America, in terms of ground, has a lot of really cool bells and whistles. They have a ton of vehicles which are super fun, but one of the areas they are lacking is in the AA department. So this is a weird and wonky Frankenstein vehicle, which gives you access to something that will be useful in the game, but also something that looks freaky and fun. And for me, as I said before, that is something I'm looking forward to in the coming few updates. Just some weird, wonky vehicles that are enjoyable to play. One of the contentious issues, I suppose, of the last 6 months, especially since, Rank 8 ground was added, was of course the Abrams and the state that it was in. A bunch of vehicles got access to spawn liners. The Abrams did not. And then also the idea of adding some Abrams with DU armor, or depleted uranium armor, especially in the turret, was talked about a lot too. And the idea right now is we don't really have a ton of vehicles like that in terms of the Abrams. There is some weird damage model stuff going on with some of the Abramses, meaning that when you pen them it doesn't really do any spalling, as if it's acting like a spawn liner, which is a bit odd. But supposedly that's not a bug, but to me that just seems like a bug. Anyway, back to the vehicles. It's pretty simple, right? I hope that in the future they add a bunch of Abrams tanks, which don't just have access to new shiny guns, or new shiny rounds, or new shiny ERA, which is basically what we've got in the last little bit, and hasn't really solved the issue. It would be nice to get some Abramses with some increased armor values, and then also some prototypes with stuff like DU armor, or with stuff like spawn liners, basically to fill out the areas to try and make it so it's kind of interesting, right? So maybe you can have an Abrams which maybe has a bit more firepower, and then you can have one which has a bit more armor, and then one which has a bit more mobility, maybe it's a bit lighter. Right now, when it comes to MBTs, especially in the highest echelon of the game, a lot of them play pretty much the same. And for America, and also many other nations, it would be nice to have stuff which have slightly different characteristics, and you can definitely do that through the addition of Abrams premiums. Well, sorry, not premiums. Prototypes. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for. We don't need any more Abrams premiums. But yeah, there's a bunch of prototypes out there which tested a bunch of different ideas, so let's get them in the game. Whether it's the Thumper, whether it's the spawn liners, or whether it's the DU armor. Let's get it done. Another part of the game which is severely lacking variety is helicopters. Most helicopters feel exactly the same and basically play the same. And at least one of the ways that America could come along and create some cool stuff is the H-56 Cheyenne. The Cheyenne is one of those which is a prototype that eventually lost out to, of course, the Apache, mainly because of just changing times and also different requirements for these things. But the Cheyenne has some cool characteristics which would make it quite fun in the game. The vehicle itself has access to the pretty standard weaponry, so it wouldn't really be too different. It has access to the towed missiles, has access to a 40mm or a 30mm or a minigun, depending on what you feel like, and then of course rockets as well. So nothing different compared to everything else. But the design of it is where it is interesting and hopefully would, make people really enjoy it. It's, of course, another helicopter from the 60s when the Americans were trying to transition from the Cobra, especially due to the Vietnam War and some of the characteristical flaws it showed during the time. But unfortunately, the Cheyenne just never took off. Instead, it was kind of sat there in the doldrums, eventually to be replaced by superior technology. And we haven't really seen the likes of it since, and that kind of sucks. Now, one of the sets of vehicles, which will always be controversial in War Thunder, but I think would provide a lot of fun, is quad bikes. Quad bikes are one of those which are used by many different nations for many different reasons, and one of the nations, which has a lot of pretty fun ones, is Iran. Iran basically takes their ATVs, or quad bikes, and just adds whatever weapon system they can find on it. Whether it's machine guns, whether it's ATGMs, whether it's, anti-air missiles or anything, and they look absolutely hilarious. There's a bunch of other nations which also do it, including America trying different things, and to be honest, I would love to see them, especially in the American tech tree if they have any technology which is involved in it. It's the last option and the funnest one, and I think overall it would be great just speeding around on these things, even if you would die very quickly, and also at the same time have basically Weasel vibes, which I think are pretty fun. As always though, I hope you have a wonderful day. Let me know what you'd like to see, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Tullio Pontecorvo, Brendan Quinn, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pieman, Wartinder, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Alan Hacker, Ozzy Panzer, Liam Shear, Opium Prime, Lafouche, Cam Arslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R. for supporting the channel.